Hello everyone, we are here today to talk to you a little bit about how we make the stories for our Witcher games. So for everyone who might not know what our Witcher games are, essentially you are playing as the Witcher, Geralt of Rivia, and you are exploring the world of the Witcher, and you basically do your job and you experience many different stories that we also refer to as quests. So those are the missions you undertake in this world. I work as a lead acting quest designer in Warsaw, and with me is Błażej.
Hello, I'm Błażej Augustynek. I'm the acting lead quest designer for Kraków, the Krakow studio. I've worked on The Witcher and Cyberpunk, been in the studio for 7 or 8 years, I think.
So my name is Philipp Weber, and then I just really want to get into the first of the topics that we want to talk about today. And that is essentially what makes our games unique. Since, there's many different ways of exploring and experiencing The Witcher. There are, of course, the original books by Andrzej Sapkowski, and then there's also, of course, the Netflix series. So we want to talk a little bit about what makes these games special.
Well, games as a medium are very different from books. That goes without saying. For us, it's important because it allows us to immerse you as the player into the world in a way that any other medium cannot do, which is really exciting as an opportunity for a game developer. Also, we've set the games in the timeline after the books, which gives us basically the whole world as a blank canvas, right? In which we can tell our own stories. The challenge there, though, is to make these stories feel like they belong in that world, like they are part of it. Like if Andrzej Sapkowski were to make a game, that would be the game he would make. That's our hope, at least, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and there's lots of questions we basically had to answer. So as an example, when the first Witcher game was developed, it was started in 2002, and basically it wasn't even clear yet if we're even gonna play as Geralt of Rivia, because basically the thought was maybe we could make our own Witcher. So for the first few years, basically, we tried to make it so you can make your own Witcher and you're exploring new lands. But then over and over, kind of the question came, the game is called The Witcher. Everyone who loves the books really likes...
know who The Witcher is, right?
Exactly, it's Geralt of Rivia. Everyone wants to play as The Witcher. So, at some point, I think everyone kind of realized, we want to be Geralt of Rivia, we want to be The Witcher, and then we basically continued the story, and we made up our own, continuation of whatever happens, and introduced back all of these characters that people actually grew to love. Alright, so we already talked a little bit about how we started, when we decided to make Geralt of Rivia, but maybe let's go even further back to the start. How do we even start, thinking about these stories that we then turn into video games?
Yeah, so, well, obviously you start by reading the books and, getting to know the lore, etc., but it's deeper than that, because we have to go to the inspiration for our own inspiration, which means to all the stuff that inspired the author of the series. And this is also inspiring for us, and we use it to build our worlds in the game, right? So it's kind of like a postmodern deconstruction almost of fairy tales and all the Slavic mythology that we use, or for the case of Beauclair we also use sorry for my French, chanson de geste of Roman mythology. So for us, we use all of that as inspiration, and the deconstruction comes from the fact that we put real people like you and I into that fantasy world filled with elves and monsters and and all that stuff. I was trying to say chimeras, but I said orcs, whatever.
No,
there's no orcs in
the
Witcher. in the Witcher world. I wanted to say chimeras. Anyway, all of that is also interesting on the meta level, because the way this world actually works, like in the lore, is it has real people from our world, like our physical world, in the fantasy world. This all happened in an event that is called the Conjunction of the Spheres, where two planets aligned and the people from our world were transported into the fantasy world that Geralt lives in. So it's interesting on a meta level, because the inspirations are actually kind of made manifest in the world.
Well, also these inspirations are kind of important when it comes to the kind of themes and like general topics we want to explore. So often, essentially, when we come up with quests, we often look at, let's say, the world that Geralt moves around in. So as an example, in The Witcher Wild Hunt, Geralt explores Velen, which is a part of Redania. And in this time, it's war-torn. So of course, we want to tell lots of stories that have to do with these topics. So we basically, when we come up with quests, we think, what themes are interesting for us to explore? What interests us, and then what interests, as an example, the audience? So for sure, as an example, if we would tell stories about a war-torn land, as an example, I as a quest designer would say, I think I have an idea. I want to make a story about, let's say, civilian suffering in this world. And then we essentially start doing our research, because we essentially always say, we're making mature games, we tell mature stories. And that doesn't mean that it has to have, gore and violence and sex. Of course, that can always be part of it. But what it actually means is that we really want to tell about topics that we think are important, that are interested to us, and that essentially make people, think when they play, and that make them feel when they play, and that are, maybe sometimes a little bit challenging. So this is often for us actually the first thing to start, essentially to really go. We don't just want to tell stories of, a witcher walking around the land and slaying monsters, because that's not what we want to do, that's not what Sapkowski did, but really to say, what is actually an interesting theme that, is worth exploring. And that's basically our rule for almost every single quest, where we just ask, why does that story need to be told? And if, we can answer all of these questions, then we usually have a good start for a quest.
But there's also a technical challenge to that, right? Because you just said war-torn land, right? And this puts a mental picture in my mind that kind of fills in the details, and I have this picture 100% rendered in my head. Now, the thing is, in a game where we want to immerse you, we actually have to do all that work. We as a team, not we as quest designers, but the whole studio has to work on rendering this war-torn land in painstaking detail, pretty much, because it's environment artists, it's FX artists, it's level designers, it's all that stuff that we need to actually physically create in the game so that it looks like a war-torn land. So all the details that in a book you can kind of fill in with an offhand sentence, we do have to render to make it immersive, right? So there's this technical thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, we also have to do it in a realistic way, because we're always saying we don't want to make a stage on which our stories take place. We actually want to create a world. And essentially, if you're supposed to be immersed in these worlds, you're also supposed to feel that it's real. So I can just give one example. In The Witcher Wild Hunt, you're exploring the city of Novigrad, which, fans of the books might already know and love. And we basically had to do tons and tons of research, our concepts teams, our environment art teams, to really see that the city shouldn't just look like any medieval city, but also it needs to function. The city is a big merchant city, so it needs a really big harbor. It, as an example, has a very famous harbor crane, and it needs, proper walls around it with lots of different gates, because Novigrad is a free city in the state of Redania, so of course it needs lots of defense. And then we also, had to think about, how do these people feed themselves? Of course, they do have a harbor.
The what do they eat question.
Exactly,
right?
What do they eat? So
the
actually,
basic question when you world build, basically.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, it's not just that, there's a city and now there's forests full of monsters. No, actually, it's a big medieval city. So of course, it is surrounded by, lands of fields that live different weeds grow there. And then, of course, we actually had people checking what kind of weeds would they grow in different parts of the world, because of course, the temperature matters and all of these details. Because the thing is, we don't necessarily have to tell you, all of this thing is there, the infrastructure, so the world works. But if they are not there, you just notice that it's missing. You just feel like I'm walking around some artificial world, but what you're supposed to feel like that you are Geralt of Rivia living in the world of The Witcher.
You take all of that subconsciously, you take it all in subconsciously, and then by just way of being there, it gives a much bigger gravitas and depth to all the stories that we tell, because they happen in your mind, real world, right, as a player.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's cool.
All right, so we talked about what kind of things inspire us when we start to come up with stories. But now let's also maybe just quickly give people a glimpse on all the challenges we actually face in making these stories into video games.
So one challenge that might be not that obvious, but it is the first thing that comes to my mind, is the point of view that the player has in the game. Because in a game you're fixed to one point of view, which is the main character's point of view, Geralt's point of view, and you can't do cuts like you would do in a movie where you show actions and events happening in a different place, different time sometimes. You are focused on just this one character and how he sees the world. So basically you're traveling through the world with like a point of view camera almost. This is a storytelling challenge, definitely, because we have to make all the important events happen in front of the character, and this means we have to justify their presence in these events, right? We do sometimes in the games, Witcher 1, Witcher 2, Witcher 3, allow you to play as a different character. So that will be the example of Ciri, for example, who you get to play as like an exciting change of pace from time to time, to see how the story develops from her point of view, because arguably she is the main character of The Witcher 3, right? You play as Geralt, but you can't help her, right?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think she's kind of all of our favorite, so we all like Ciri very much. Well, the thing is also, we talked about, that we create an open world and not just a stage, but it also kind of creates these challenges for actually making a story then, because usually if you want to tell a story, you want to go from A to B to C, and usually you want to make the choices that are, best for the flow of the story. But we, of course, say we want to make an open world so you can run everywhere. So as an example, if you're walking around with a character, player might decide to just run away. And then, our game and our stories, they still kind of need to work. So it is actually often our job to essentially make sure that whatever action the player can take, the story still works. And, sometimes the story notices. Sometimes a character might, complain if you're rude to them. And I think that's always, it's always nice when you can actually, as a player, I think, find these little spots. But of course, also, it's kind of one challenge that we have is to not make you want to run away, to actually make you want to follow that story along. And usually, when we can tell that, while playing our quests, people just, they start looking around and they start running away, and probably something's also wrong with our quest and we should change our approach a little.
This might actually happen when you present choices that are not intuitive for the player at the point where they are presented to you, because as quest designers we have to sort of anticipate what would be the natural reactions, not only for the player but also for Geralt, when presented with a problem, right? It really feels bad when you want to approach a certain situation from a certain in a certain way, and the game doesn't present you with that option. That's not fun. So what we need to do is we need to anticipate what the player might want to do, and then when that choice presents itself, it feels really good because you can actually do that thing that logically made sense to you, right?
And also we kind of have to give you that power to be able to make those choices. So all three of the Witcher games are RPGs, so role-playing games, and you usually play the role of Geralt of Rivia. Thing is, Geralt of course knows the rules of the world of The Witcher. He knows the culture, he knows the politics. And then it is also our job to make the player be able to know all of these things. So, we're not gonna start the game by saying, okay, you're in the kingdom of Redania, this is the king of Redania, this is, all the laws that exist. But we kind of try to do it naturally. So as an example, you might walk by some peasants that complain about, someone raised the taxes again. And these kind of, details where you really start, getting a feeling for how the world works. What is the culture? What kind of religions do people have? What do they believe in? And then, once you get all of that information, I think you're also able to, make choices. Because if you don't have any information to base your decisions on, that's not a good choice. That's just, choosing A and B, and I don't know what A and B are or, what they could cause. So that's also a very important job that we have to make that possible.
And sometimes we use the player's character Geralt as a tool for exposition, because he does know this stuff, so he can use it. He can tell it to the player, so to speak. But this also builds into the fact of player expectations, because the Witcher universe is books, comics, series, movies. There's this famous Polish movie, and all of this stuff has built a layer of expectations that fans. Even us, right? I remember the first time we saw the Yennefer model. Like everyone gathered at Mateusz Tomaszkiewicz's computer, our quest director. Well, he was lead back then, right? And everyone gathered around his computer, and they were looking at how Yennefer looks in the game. It was the first time I saw her, and everyone had their opinions, of course. But but at the end of the day, it was really something to see, the mental image that we had of her after reading the books and watching the movies rendered on the computer screen, and then a big privilege of getting to actually use this model, right? And make quests with it and all of that stuff. So yeah.
All right, so maybe let's get a little bit to the star of our games, which is Geralt of Rivia. And of course, as you're playing The Witcher, you're playing Geralt. And there are some unique challenges when essentially making him a video game character that you as a player are controlling. Maybe let's talk a little bit about that part.
Yeah, this is actually super interesting because I noticed it first when I played The Witcher 1 as a fan. So there's this whole gamut of actions that Geralt does that are mentioned in the books. The making of potions, obviously the sword fighting, horse riding, all these things that kind of build a picture of what it means to be a Witcher in this world, right? And for this experience in the game to be immersive, we need to translate all of that into gameplay actions, into things that the player can do. Because by doing these things, by sword fighting, by mixing potions, researching monsters, talking to people, really, also, that's a big part of it. You start to feel like a Witcher, basically, because that's what you're doing for your interaction with the game, right?
Well, it's also for us, we just had to pretty much adopt his character. Because I think for many people, when they see Geralt for the first time, they think like, oh, he has a deep, raspy voice. He's probably some graph, some action hero. But the thing is, Geralt is a bit more than that. He actually has a lot of depth as a character. I really like his dry humor very much. And he has, very interesting friendships. I always love it when he discusses philosophy with his friends. My favorite, Regis. It's always the best times. But also, basically, Geralt has a unique role in this world. He is a mutant. And the world of The Witcher, is a fantasy world, but also it has lots of, real life topics. There's lots of racism in this world. There's sexism. It is a fantasy world, but it's kind of
place.
Exactly. It is a place that could have existed. Mix the real medieval world with fantasy. So Geralt is an outsider. Geralt has cat eyes. He has white hair, and people do know what a Witcher is. A Witcher is there to kill monsters. But for most people, a Witcher is not that much better than a monster. They're accepted as long as they do their job. Exactly, they're a mutant.
He says that he's not human multiple times.
Yeah,
he doesn't feel like he belongs to the race, really.
Yeah, that's the thing. People, tend to spit at him when they see him in the streets, and you are essentially inhabiting this role. Geralt is not a shining hero in a shining armor. He usually often, he tries to do the right thing, but usually, a Witcher is supposed to stay neutral. But, in the end, if he's to make a choice between good and evil, he'd rather not make a choice at all. So, of course, we have to honor that character and, make you really inhabit him. So we introduced ourselves as quest designers. So maybe let's actually go a little bit into detail about how one of these quests, one of these stories is created. So as I said before, we essentially always start with the question of, what is the topic of this quest? What is the theme? And once we pretty much know what are the interesting topics that interest us, we basically go to the next stage where I think, it's a very common thing in the story business. We essentially pitch a story. And this can be done by the quest designers or, of course, by our best friends in the studio, the story writers. We always work as a very close-knit team. And basically we write the story in a very short form to basically, give interesting glimpses in it. And then we, of course, have the lead quest designers, we have the directors, who basically check these pitches and pretty much choose their favorites. And if your pitch is chosen, then comes the next very interesting part, which is called the quest design. And there we essentially write down the whole quest from start to finish in its full form. So basically, when you read this document, in your head, in the best case scenario, you can already imagine the way it would play. This is, of course, a very challenging thing because our stories are not linear. You're not going from A to B to Z. You can make lots of choices in your story. Yes, right? You actually need to show it visually so people know.
Graphs.
Yeah, like, oh, here's this direction going up there, but there's another one. And then they go together again. And this is a thing that we actually have as a challenge to really represent. So when I'm reading this quest design, I can follow all the different directions the story can go in, all the choices and consequences that come from these choices. And basically, of course, as always, it goes through multiple iterations. Once it's accepted, then comes the fun part, and we actually start implementing the quest into the game engine, and we work with lots of different teams, and then you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, and in that moment, the quest designer becomes kind of like a spider inside the net, because we have contact with pretty much everyone on the team, every specialty, and there is a lot of specialties of people that work in making games. So you've got I'm gonna forget someone, and I'm just gonna say I'm sorry if I forgot about you. But you've got like your enviro artists, your level designers, your gameplay designers. You've got writers, obviously, cinematic designers, FX artists, audio designers. There's more, and we basically talk to them. We send them documents, we talk to them, we organize all the stuff, we try to sell them our vision, basically. And sometimes there's interesting stuff happening because we talk, yes, but we need to listen as well.
Yeah.
Because there's sometimes there's stuff happening that we wouldn't have thought that ourselves, basically. So there's this example I can give you. When I was working on a little document, when I outlining the location of Tucson in Blood and Wine, in the expansion. And I was going through the book and just looking at what locations were mentioned, putting them down in the document, trying to put them on the map, etc. And this created like a rough outline of how the world is going to look like. And then handed it over to other teams. Then it lived with its own life. They asked me questions sometimes. And then I got to open up the world in the game editor that we work in. And I saw additional places that were between the connection, that were connecting the places that I mentioned. They logically made sense. And I remember the sense of, I would call it awe, really.
Yeah.
when I saw there was a quarry and there was a river, right? And the story was that the stone from the quarry was transported in the river, right? By boat, and so. It's a little thing, but it really impressed me that they actually connected the two places with like a canal, because that made sense, right? Logically. I didn't think of it, they did.
Yeah, that is the thing that, we always, when we talk about, we're making the quests, but that's not really the case. We're kind of, let's say, responsible for the quest coming together, but it's this whole collaborative work that everyone actually chips in. And, not necessarily even just in their specific specialty. Often, some of my best, story twists, story decisions in my quests were ideas that just, team members had when, we were playing the quest together or just talking to each other. And that's also, let's say, an important thing to, for us to never be someone who says, this is my specialty, this is the job I do, because that's not how we make games. We make games as a team. We all love making Witcher games, and everyone has their ideas. So I think, as you said, one of our biggest, most important things in our jobs is to listen and to just talk to each other, because everyone wants to make the best game possible. And I think if you pretty much keep doing that, then, there's a good chance that you're going to make a good game.
On that stage, there's surprisingly little time that we spend in front of a computer, right?
Yeah, exactly. we basically spend a lot of time just talking to each other, which is good because, you kind of need this basis to then actually start making the quest that your people are actually going to play. So in our Witcher games, one of the, I think, most famous aspects is, of course, as I said earlier, that we're not telling linear stories that go from A to B to Z, because there's a player involved. So our games aren't, let's say, a monologue of the author telling you what happens. They are a dialogue, because you as a player can make choices that just change the flow of the whole story. And because our games are pretty long, there's often hundreds of these choices, and of course, a choice is only good if it has a really good consequence. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about the choice and consequence.
Yes. So one thing is that I kind of mentioned this already before. The choices need to feel appropriate for the situation. They need to feel natural in the moment, in the context of what's going on. But the other thing that needs to happen as well is the choices need to fit Geralt as a character that you're inhabiting, because this is a role-playing game, right? So you are playing his role. And, we always have these discussions where we use this term that, no, Geralt wouldn't do that. Right?
Yeah.
But this is a challenge sometimes. But thankfully, Geralt is an internally torn character, because he is striving to be professional, neutral. He's trying to uphold this mythos of being a witcher, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, internally, he's a good guy. Basically, he's almost like a white knight. He's trying not to be.
Yeah, he would never admit it.
Well, sometimes he does. He does look like a black metal, band guy. But internally, he's warm and fuzzy, and he's a really cool friend. You mentioned his humor, right? That's something that's surprising when you first hear it. But yeah, going back to those choices, this gives us like a range of approaches to any given situation. Some of this comes out of the context, but some of it comes out of him as a person, and this dichotomy that he has within himself, where he tries to, you can play him as just the neutral, professional, maybe slightly cynic kind of guy, or you can play him as, white knight, basically, and just helping everyone.
Well, that's also the thing that's often a bit of a head scratcher when we start with our quests. Is often this question of, why would Geralt even help these people? Why would he even do that? Because that's actually a question that is important, because usually in video games, well, your character does it because you're a player and you want to do it.
Yeah.
But you're playing Geralt of Rivia.
Right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. he just doesn't do anything. So there always needs to be this specific reason that interests him. And when we do these choices and consequences, we also want to make it so the player is actually interested in making those. Because you always feel, let's say, if you have choices in a story and they're very clearly, this is the good choice, this is the evil choice, this is the stupid choice, then it's kind of boring. Then you're not using your head. We actually try to keep it, a bit more interesting. Earlier we talked about how we make mature stories.
And we really can't use the evil choice, because Geralt is not evil. Geralt wouldn't do that. Right?
Yeah, you can't have a choice where Geralt's just, yes, I'm gonna slaughter all the innocent people. That's just, nothing that would make sense in our stories.
Well, it did happen in Blaviken, though.
But that's the thing.
But were they innocent?
Because that's the thing. Because even in the books and in our games, the choices aren't just good or evil. Usually, it's a really difficult choice to make. And as an example, in Blaviken, which of course, fans of the Netflix series might have seen as well, there is a very difficult choice that Geralt has to make there. And as an example, if this was a quest in the game, that might be an available choice to, fight Renfri and her people. But the thing is, maybe we would also then have to give you context for maybe Geralt doesn't fight him. Maybe Geralt actually, through whatever story thing happens, could help them. But then, of course, when it comes to Blaviken, this would result in really dire and big consequences. And this is the thing that we pretty much have to handle, that every choice needs to have a really interesting consequence. And the thing is, these consequences can't just be surprises. You can't just make a choice and then an hour later, a thing happens now. They can be surprising, but if it's a good, let's say, choice and consequence, you always know, where it's coming from. Exactly, they have to make some logical sense, even if they are surprising.
Yeah, and if you have a lot of these choices, and you said you want to have hundreds of them, that means a lot of consequences. And a lot of consequences means that the structure of the game has the potential of becoming unmanageable, because there's so many alternate realities that you create when you choose stuff, that we as developers need to handle. That we do this thing where we create convergence points. One example of this is the Battle of Kaer Morhen, which was made by Paweł Sasko, our lead quest designer right now. And this is a point where kind of all the things that happened before it have their effect, and they have their consequences, and you can see them play out beat by beat, basically throughout the whole defense of Kaer Morhen. It's a very rewarding experience, because it feels like everything you did at this point mattered, right? But for us as developers, it's helpful because we kind of close that topic and we move on with the story.
Yeah, all those different things that are flowing around, they all just can come together again, and then we pretty much know where we are.
And then we can use them here and there, but the whole story is, the story arc is closed.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much also one of the most, let's say the unique thing about our Witcher games, which is that you are actually an active participant in the story. You shape the way the story goes. You are Geralt of Rivia, or you are Ciri, and you make these choices for these characters. And as an example, if you feel like, Sultan is Geralt's friend, now he's also your friend, and you talk to him in a way.
It's personal, right?
Exactly, and you kind of feel very attached to them, and it's pretty much your adventure. And I think one of the absolutely coolest things about my job is to, after the game is out, when you hear people talking about, as an example, my quests, and they talk about the story, and they just have completely different experiences. Like someone made a choice that's completely different than another one has, or maybe they get both the same result, but one is angry about it and the other one loves it, and they think, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And this is actually what I really like about it, and that's why it's actually fun to do these non-linear stories where people can actually be this active participant, and I think that's kind of what makes the games really special.